All right, good morning one more time. My name is Stephanie. I'm the lead pastor here at Mill City. If I haven't met you yet, we're so glad that you're here. If you are maybe visiting with us or here for one of the first few times, I know it takes courage to come and join a new community, so thank you for being here. We're so glad that you're here. Sorry that I gave a controversial question for everybody to ask. You know, like that's a hard one, so let's be honest here. When we're thinking about like traditional voicemails, who's left a voicemail in the last couple weeks? Okay. Is there anybody who's like, absolutely not? Nope, no. Okay, kind of in between. All right. See, I just be willing to suggest that not that long ago, like everybody be like, yeah, voicemails, obviously, but things are changing. Look, and I'm not positive, but I think my generation, the elder millennials, might be responsible for the beginning of the voicemail's demise. And I think it's because, so we were born at the end of the 70s, early 80s, and we're old enough to have had one of these in our houses. Okay, so what this is, young people, this is an answering machine, and it would be next to the phone, and that's where the voicemails would be stored, in that box. Yep, yes, that's called a landline. Anyway, but we're also young enough to be people who are like, I think we're done with voicemails, generally speaking. Okay, so a lot of us, we're ready to be done. And I don't know, I can't speak for my whole generation as to why we feel done with voicemails. I'm talking about the ones that like are permanent, not the ones that disappear. That's a whole nother thing. I think we're done with them for a number of reasons. One of my reasons is I don't really want recordings of my voice just on people's phones, for them to listen to them and re-listen to them again. Because I already like go over conversations in my brain and think, oh man, that sounded so awkward, or why did I say that? I'm not the only person that does that, right? Yeah, okay, so like you're playing these conversations over and over and you're thinking like, oh, that was so weird, or I should have said this, you know? And what I don't understand is like, why is it always the weird conversations that come back to me? Why can't I remember when I said something awesome or somebody gave like a really great compliment or an encouragement or something? No, we don't remember those things. Or like 3 hours later, you're like, oh, that's what I should have said, right? Like this is what's happening. Some of you are probably professionals at replaying conversations in your brain. You replay them while you're driving. You replay them while you're brushing your teeth. And the worst thing, you replay them when you're trying to fall asleep. Yeah, okay. The problem is that even though some of them eventually fade, some of them stick with you, don't they? The ones that stick with you tend to be things like the argument that you never repaired, or that misunderstanding, or that friendship that just seemed to fall out. You don't remember the last thing that you said, or those words you just wish you could take back or say in a different way. They just get stuck replaying in our minds, but it's not just in our minds. It ends up really affecting how we see ourselves. And then how we see ourselves affects our relationships, how we go forward. And this turns out to not just be something that we're imagining. Psychologists actually call this a negativity bias, that our brains naturally give more weight to painful experiences than to positive experiences. So you've got like one hurtful comment and it outweighs 10 encouraging things that someone might have said. Some of us remember 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago something that a friend or a teacher or a parent said, and somehow we forgot all the surrounding words of encouragement, right? The conversations that we most replay in our minds and in our hearts are the ones that lead us to the question, do I really belong? Do I still belong? And today we're continuing this conversation we're just calling barriers to belonging. The barriers in our lives that keep us from belonging with God, the sense of belonging with each other, and sometimes even the sense of belonging with ourselves and like feeling like we know who we are. And so today I want to talk about a barrier to belonging that every one of us has faced, and it's relational wounds. Sometimes little ones, sometimes big ones, but everyone has faced them because if you're going to love people, eventually you're going to be hurt by people. And that's not a cynical statement. This is the cost of closeness. This is the cost of closeness. Sometimes those wounds come from words that people say or they don't say. Sometimes those wounds come from betrayal or misunderstanding and other things that I mentioned earlier. Those reality for most of us is that the closer the relationship, the deeper the wounds can be, right? And because those wounds are so painful, we want to protect ourselves. So we've been talking about how the pain that all of us experience, it causes us on the surface of our lives to protect ourselves. That is understandable. Please don't feel shame about that. We all do this. And so when we have wounds relationally, the way we protect ourselves are things like holding people at arm's length, avoiding vulnerability, convincing ourselves it's better to be alone than to risk being hurt again. And the problem is that the very thing we're protecting ourselves from can become the thing that keeps us from the belonging that we're made for. And so that's maybe one of the reasons that we're living through what many have called the epidemic of loneliness, right? This is something we bring up here at Mill City a lot because this reality is a huge barrier in living the way of Jesus. And not only that, it's a deeply detrimental reality for our general health and well-being, in being able to live in community with others. I don't know if some of you have read, the Surgeon General in 2023 had this report declaring that loneliness and social isolation is a public health epidemic. More than half of the adults reported feeling lonely, and about 1 in 4 say they know they lack social and emotional support that they need. That's the people who are aware enough to report it. We know now from this study and others that it increases the likelihood of all sorts of health problems. We're talking like heart and brain damage type problems. And the evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. I know some of you are seeing the same things I am. One recent study found that the average number of words that people speak to one another has decreased over the last 2 decades significantly. So we're not just feeling more isolated, we are actually talking to each other less. When relationships become painful, we all have some different instincts of what to do, but it's usually things like distancing or self-protection or trying to take control of the situation. But Jesus shows us a different way. Jesus shows us a different way. If you read through the Gospels, the stories about Jesus, let me tell you, Jesus experiences relational wounds of every kind from all the different types of people in his life. He is misunderstood. Jesus is falsely accused and betrayed and abandoned and hurt by words and by actions of people. Yet over and over, what we see in Jesus' life is that Jesus doesn't avoid difficult relationships. He moves toward them with intention. The story that we're going to look at today is about a person who I think must have been replaying one conversation over and over in his mind, and that's Peter. Peter is one of Jesus' disciples, but not just that. Scripture tells us he's one of Jesus' closest couple of friends. And the Gospels give us this window into one of the most important relationships in Jesus' life, his friendship with Peter while he's here on earth. And when Jesus was experiencing his greatest suffering, when he was being beaten and led to the cross, Peter gave into fear and denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times. And to make it worse, and to be even more painful, Jesus had predicted that it would happen, and Peter had confidently promised, never! That just makes it worse, doesn't it? And so you have to imagine that Peter replayed that conversation where he was so confident over and over again. That Peter replayed over and over those 3 times that he had denied Jesus. So I want to actually go to kind of a story towards the end of Peter and Jesus' relationship in John chapter 21. And this is an encounter where Jesus is encountering some of the disciples, including Peter. Jesus has already gone to the cross. He was resurrected and he came back to life. And after the resurrection, a lot of the disciples were kind of like, okay, what do we do now? And so they're trying to figure it out. And some just went back to what they had been doing before they met Jesus. And that's what's happening here. Peter and some of the other disciples are fishing. That's what they did to make a living. And so they're going out and they're fishing. Peter and some of the disciples, they fish all night long and they don't catch anything, which maybe feels real personal to somebody in this room right now. I know, it's tough. Okay, and then as morning breaks, they see a man off on the shore, and the man calls out to them and tells them to throw their net onto the other side of the boat, which must have felt pretty patronizing. But they do it. And then all of a sudden they pull in just overflowing net full of fish. And then John, the other closest friend of Jesus, he's the first one to realize what's going on. He says, "That's the Lord. That's Jesus." And Peter doesn't even wait for the boat. He jumps out and he starts swimming over to the shore because he wants to see Jesus. And he gets there and everyone else finally gets to shore when the boat gets there. And Jesus cooks breakfast for them and they're sitting and they're eating. And after breakfast, Jesus does something that I think would have been pretty unexpected. He turns to Peter, and it's not to shame him. It's not to lecture him. He's not going to pretend or avoid that this denial happened. Jesus lovingly walks Peter back to the very wound that he must have been replaying since the night that he denied even knowing Jesus. So I'm going to pick it up in verse 15 of chapter 21. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." Then a third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And Peter did just that. When you follow Peter's story, Jesus followed Jesus and he loved those that he was called to lead. He did not become perfect. He still made mistakes. But in the book of Acts, we see the story of a man who was transformed by the Spirit. He was able to follow the words and works and ways of Jesus in incredible ways. Peter becomes one of the core leaders of the early church, helping lead through unimaginable challenges. God uses him to be a part of launching this movement that is still what we're part of here today, 2,000 years later. And John tells us here, you notice, that they're describing that Jesus is pointing to the kind of death that Peter would once die. And we don't actually know from Scripture every detail with certainty, but church tradition holds that Peter was executed in Rome under Nero's persecution and that he died by crucifixion. And the point is not that the dying part is glorious. The point is that Peter remained faithful to Jesus all the way to the end, right? The man who once denied Jesus out of fear, Jesus is saying, it's not going to happen again. He will follow him and he will not turn back. Jesus asks Peter that same question 3 times, intentionally kind of like echoing Peter's 3 denials of Jesus. People often describe this as Jesus reinstating Peter. And that's true. But before Jesus restores Peter's calling, he restores Peter's relationship with him. Right? Before Peter is commissioned and the others are commissioned to go out and to share Jesus' message with the world of love, he first makes sure that Peter knows we're okay. I don't know if Peter even knew how much he needed that. He needed to know that they were okay. Jesus refuses to let Peter's worst moment become the defining moment of their relationship. I just was thinking about this and I was like, can you imagine if Jesus had let that happen? Like Jesus said that, you know what? That failure was 1 strike too many, Peter. What if that betrayal was just simply too deep? Because if you've read the Gospels, you know Peter has already stumbled plenty of times by the time we get to John chapter 21. But Jesus doesn't keep score. Jesus restores his relationship. And when you step back and you look at Peter's relationship with Jesus throughout the Gospels, you honestly would probably not blame Jesus if he did keep score with Peter. Peter was kind of one of those like act first, think second kind of guys. Some of you know those types of people. Some of you are those types of people, right? That's all right. But we see this over and over. We see that he jumps out of the boat in faith, right? But then he sinks, and then he actually gets into these arguments with Jesus, right? And then he falls asleep when he's supposed to stay up and pray, and then he pulls out a sword and cuts this soldier's ear after Jesus had been teaching about peace, and then he runs away, and finally he denies even knowing Jesus 3 times. As one of Jesus' closest friends, if anyone had a reason to keep record of relational wounds, it was Jesus. But Jesus refuses to let those wounds have the final word. He doesn't ignore the wound, though, right? He confronts it and he offers space for that healing. He doesn't define Peter by his worst moment. He restores him. And then he sends a restored Peter out back into his other relationships and into his calling. That's the way of Jesus. And if we're going to overcome the barrier of relational wounds, that needs to be our way as well. That way of restoration. I want you just to think about the relationships in your life that have been close relationships. All of the relationships in my life that have meant the most to me have wounded me in some way. Every single one of them. Every one of them. Why? Again, because if we're going to love people, then eventually we're going to be hurt by people. It's simply the cost of closeness. Now, here's an important caveat that we bring up here at Mill City often. It's important to note. Healing from a relational wound does not always mean restoring closeness with the person that hurt you. Sometimes the healthiest thing is to create some pretty significant boundaries. Sometimes it's to actually end the relationship. Relational wounds that come from abusive or consistently unsafe situations, when people say, well, people hurt people, that is not a reason to return to those types of relationships. That's not a reason to say we don't need to set up boundaries with that kind of thing. But here's the hard reality, is that if we don't intentionally heal, then any relationship, those wounds don't stay confined in those relationships, do they? They affect all of our other relationships. They follow us into the next one and the next one. I'll give you an example of this in my own life. Right before I met my husband, I was in the serious dating relationship before I met my husband, okay? And it became obvious that dating relationship had to come to an end. We needed to go our separate ways. There had been some dishonesty, some betrayal. I was feeling some deep wounds at this point. And thank goodness I was able to see a therapist at that time, this great guy. And one day, I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, well, we've really worked on this healing from that breakup, and I think we've kind of done all we can do on that until you're in your next relationship. And I was like, wait, I'm sorry, huh? And he's like, well, the thing is that, we've pursued healing, but the next relationship you're in, the next time you're dating somebody, they're going to wound you. And you're going to wound them. And then we'll see what healing still has to happen. I mean, I remember walking out of that session and thinking, you know what? Maybe no more dating at all. No. I don't know if I want to do that. And I mean, that sounds funny, but I'm actually somebody who does not believe you need a partner to have a meaningful life. And so I was seriously considering this. I was like, listen, true belonging doesn't happen with just one other person. God's belonging breadth for us is community. I'm like, maybe that's it for me, but you got to trust the Lord. And I felt like, I think I need to turn back around and face this. And so I ended up in my relationship with JD next, and things started to get serious. You kind of know when things get serious in a relationship because you wound each other usually. That's when you're like, oh, it's serious. We're, actually care what this person is thinking. And so anyway, I told him, I said, I got to tell you about this conversation I had with this therapist and how he told me that the next relationship, some of this other stuff's going to come up. And, and it did. And, huge shout out to mine and JD's current marriage counselor, Carol. Thank goodness, right? So this is it. This is the process. Anyway, I look back now and I think that when that therapist was warning me about that, he wasn't just talking about dating. He wasn't just talking about marriage or partnerships. He was talking about relationships in general. And how when we are wounded in relationships, it's going to be a part of our other relationships, right? The wounds we get from our families are going to show up in our friendships, and the wounds from our friendships are going to show up in our partnerships, right, in our marriages, and the wounds from our marriages are going to affect our parenting, and you see where I'm going here, right? What happens beneath the surface has this way of surfacing wherever and with whomever we are close with. That's why we can't ignore this barrier. We won't, I'm going to say we won't experience perfect belonging before Jesus returns and restores the brokenness in this world. But here's what I really believe is true. I believe Jesus wants us to experience far deeper belonging than many of us settle for. Here and now, before he returns to restore all things. I believe that there's the power to be able to do that. And so part of that journey to experiencing the deeper belonging with God and others is that we have to refuse to let relational wounds have the final word. Just like Jesus refused to let it happen with Peter. Whenever we experience these wounds in relationships, we all have kind of different responses. I kind of see like 3 categories of those responses that we all naturally drift towards. You might have some others. But what I want us to do today is to just kind of address some of these and just be like, let's look at our lives and just be honest so that we can pursue healing. If we can't name it, it's pretty tough for us to really be able to start that healing. So here's kind of the 3 responses to wounds that I see. I think we put up walls. I think we withdraw from relationships. And also we grab what I'm going to call relational weapons at times, okay? And Peter knew all 3 of these if you follow his story. So let's just start one at a time, and I'm just inviting you. All of this is not true for everybody, but I think there's some truth in here for all of us. Let's look at this first one of this tendency to put up walls, okay? Throughout the Gospels, Peter often seems to have this tough exterior when you read his story. He is quick to speak, he's quick to correct, he's quick to defend himself, right? When Jesus predicts Peter will deny him, Peter immediately says, I would never do that. Some of us have realized when we hear never, always, like we got to tone it down, right? Sometimes our walls look like Peter's. Defensiveness, the need to always be right, always needing to prove ourselves. But other times, for others, the walls are a lot quieter. We keep people at arm's length. We might be surrounded by people, but we still feel pretty alone. We have this protective voice inside that says, if no one gets too close, then they can't hurt me too bad. Can I just name some things? So like there's one thing that I've noticed here at Mill City, and you guys can tell me what's really going on here, but I'm curious about it, all right? Here's what I've noticed. We'll be at Second Sunday lunch, or we'll be out in the park, and I'll notice like people connecting for the first time. And I'm like watching this because that's what people like me do. I'm like, look at that connecting. This is awesome. And then I'll hear people say something like, oh, we should get together sometime, or our family should do dinner. And then they go their separate ways without getting any contact information at all. And I'm going, okay, what's happening? So sometimes I ask, like, well, did you get coffee? Did the families get together? And usually no. And I'm like, did you get the phone number? And so I don't know what's behind that every single time. Sometimes it's just people didn't think of it, I guess. But I'm curious if sometimes it's revealing something. That we long for belonging, but we fear what might happen if we actually take that next step. Because if I never text you, then I never have to feel like upset that you didn't text me back. Right? Because I never have to take the risk that I don't have to experience rejection, because we do experience rejection. That's real. And so there's this way of protecting ourselves, right? These are walls that protect us from pain. And while they might do that, they also keep us from belonging. And so here's the question I hope that each of us can ask. Where have protective walls become barriers? Where have those protective walls become barriers? Those walls are there for a reason. Don't feel shame about that. But where have they become barriers to belonging? Because here's the thing. No other human can take those walls down for you. Every once in a while, I'm with coffee with someone, and I think they think I can take their walls down for them. I'm with them, but I can't do it. But let me tell you this. When you're ready to start to take those walls down, the Spirit of Jesus is remarkably patient with you, but will be there with you for that. And will help you, walking with you one step at a time as you learn to trust again. I've experienced that myself. So, where have protective walls become barriers? The second response that I feel is a category of responses are relational wounds lead us to withdraw from relationships. To withdraw from relationships. You notice in Peter's life, he could seem incredibly brave one moment, and then when fear took over, he runs the next minute. And I think some of us know that feeling, right? Like the courage we had all of a sudden can disappear in an instant when something feels threatening to us. So what does that withdrawing look like in your life? Sometimes it's like a physical withdrawal, like you just don't show up or you stop engaging. You quietly are convincing yourself if relationships hurt, better not to have them really. Or there's an even sneakier thing that I've noticed with some of us is that we set these unreachable expectations of others and then, oh, no shock here, they couldn't reach them. But it's just this permission to withdraw. Sometimes we do what the kids call ghosting, okay? Now, Pastor Asher says he's not sure the kids are saying that anymore, actually. So some kids said, oh, some of them are. Okay, they also said you might be leaving somebody unread. Is that a thing? Okay, so that means like someone texted you and you just do not text them back. You know they texted you, but you don't text them back. They might have left a voicemail. And you know, like I usually call back and just go, I didn't listen to the voicemail, what did you say? But like, you don't even call back. You don't even call back. Or you don't show up to the group and you're like, well, I didn't technically commit to it, right? I mean, this is what can easily happen. Sometimes it's just never taking the first step. Sometimes it's hiding away, or sometimes, and this is something that I just want people to wonder about together, sometimes it's busyness that creates no room left for relationships. We want somewhere inside of us to go deeper, but our calendars just don't allow it. There's not space for those spontaneous connections or those vulnerable conversations or the investment that it takes to get into a deeper relationship because life is just too busy. And I like to think of it as like, well, life's with belonging is full, but when it's busy, it's just kind of keeping us from those connections. And you just got to explore that yourself. Over and over, studies have shown that it takes over 200 hours to develop a close friendship. And those are unstructured hours. Whoa, like that's a lot. And I know life is busy. I have a pretty full calendar and full life. And I don't want anyone to feel guilty about it. I just want us all to just explore, is there a chance that busyness has become a form of withdrawal, like a permission to kind of back off? Because sometimes I think that can be the case and we don't even realize it. Other times you have a really full calendar because you are prioritizing belonging, which is awesome. But that is a question I think is helpful because that isolation can start to feel really safe. And hiding behind our calendars can feel like people are even proud of us for all the things we're doing. And so I just want us to recognize that even though it feels safe, it comes at a pretty high cost. The very thing that feels like it's protecting us slowly becomes the thing that guarantees loneliness. So here's the overarching question. Where have you found yourself withdrawing from relationships? Maybe the first step is not to force yourself into a room full of people, okay? I mean, I know that social anxiety is a real thing. We're not saying everyone needs to be with big groups. But maybe the first step for any of us is to draw closer to Jesus, to experience the belonging that Jesus has for us and to start to heal some of those wounds that maybe have been underneath that withdrawal for a long time. I really believe that the Spirit will give you the courage to take the steps you need to take towards the healing that you need in your life. I've experienced this in my own life. Okay, so where have you found yourself withdrawing from relationships? The third response is grabbing what I call relational weapons, all right? So Peter knew this too in a lot of ways, but I think of the obvious one where the soldiers came to arrest Peter, and Peter didn't run, not at first, right? He grabs his sword, he swung it, and he cuts off a man's ear. When we're wounded and we're afraid, many of us, our gut reaction is to reach for weapons too, but not literal ones, but relational ones. Sometimes our weapon is criticism. I've seen so many of these in my life. Like sometimes the weapon we grab is control or cynicism or needing to be right. Or we grab the weapon of putting people in categories before we even know them. Sometimes it's so easy. Like we don't even know their story, but we're like, well, people like that, those people like that always. And what we realize is othering becomes a way to protect ourselves. If I can reduce somebody to a category, then I don't have to risk understanding them. And then sometimes the hardest thing is to see that these weapons show up in the relationships with the people that we're closest to. In marriage, every disagreement becomes about winning instead of understanding the other person. With our kids, control becomes something that replaces curiosity about their little minds and hearts. At work, we assume the worst of those people and their motives instead of asking questions. Even in the church, there's times when our weapons, they can actually sound kind of spiritual, you know? It's easy to kind of be on the outside of something and kind of criticize it and evaluate it. I'm just evaluating. Instead of stepping inside and being a part of the hard work of building the belonging. It's difficult. And the irony is these weapons can sometimes kind of feel justified, right? Like, well, I'm just telling the truth. I'm a truth teller. Or, I'm just protecting what's important. This is really important. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. I'm brave enough to say it. But here is the core problem. Weapons might help us win arguments, but they rarely build belonging. Jesus put Peter's sword back in its place. Not because the truth doesn't matter or because those people taking Jesus weren't in the wrong, but because the kingdom that Jesus is building never grows through fear or domination or winning. The kingdom that Jesus is leading, the kingdom of God, only grows through self-giving love. That's what Jesus shows us. So here's the question. What weapons have become your default response when you feel hurt? What weapons have become your default response? Because Jesus doesn't just help us put the sword down. The Spirit of Jesus teaches us a whole nother way. The way of Jesus, the way of gentleness, the way of humility, the way of perseverance, the way of curiosity, the way of Jesus. So when we look at these things, it feels really important to me for our community and for our lives, our families, our friendships, that we are honest about some of these things. Just to examine our lives. Where have we put up these walls? Where have we withdrawn? Where do we lean towards grabbing those relational weapons? Because there's so much at stake. It's not just that they protect us from pain. They also become barriers to the belonging that God made us for. And not only that, God made us to experience that belonging in a world that is increasingly isolated. That's part of our mission. Here's the good news. Great news. We can move toward others because God has first moved toward us. The God of the universe came to this world in the form of a human in Jesus. Earlier, John says in chapter 1, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. God came to be with us, to experience the barriers that we all face. Jesus has experienced them. Think about this. The incarnation was the greatest act of relational vulnerability in history. God becoming a human. Jesus entered our world knowing exactly what it was going to cost him. Jesus moved toward the relationships with the people he knew were going to reject him. Jesus didn't build walls, he crossed them. Jesus did not withdraw, he drew near. Jesus did not reach for weapons. What did he do? He stretched out his arms and his hands and gave up his life out of self-giving love. And what happened when he did this? The weapons of others pierced him so that he could prove that belonging with God is possible. To show that love, that nothing can separate us from the love that God has for us. So if you have been replaying that conversation, you know the one, over and over. If you have been carrying shame and it's getting heavier. If you know there's some trauma that needs some tending to. If you've started to believe that your worst moment is your defining moment. Hear the invitation of Jesus. Just like he did with Peter, Jesus still moves toward wounded people. He still restores relationships. He still says to all of us what he said to Peter, follow me, follow my way. And because Jesus first moved toward us and has sent his Spirit now, we have access to wisdom from the Spirit, and we have access to courage to take the steps that we need to take. Following Jesus has always required courage. That's not new. When we choose to love others and to move toward them. It's not because people deserve it. When we choose to love people in the way of Jesus, it's not because every relationship's going to be restored. It won't. It's not because we're not going to get wounded again. We will. It's not because we think that everything's going to work out fine. We move toward others in love because we've already experienced a love that refused to stay at a distance from us, a love that came looking for us. And so the invitation today, look, it's not to walk out of here and be like, I'm tearing my walls down, I'm going to do it. I got to just, it's not going to be like, I'll figure out why I'm withdrawing and I'll let you know how I figured it out myself later. It's not going to work. If you're going to say, okay, I'm going to leave my weapons here under the stage and hopefully they won't come with me. No, it's not going to happen. I really think that it's actually a lot simpler than that. I think it's drawing close to Jesus and recognizing that when we draw close to Jesus, we can ask the Spirit, what is my next step? Because I don't know what it is, but I believe the Spirit of Jesus wants to reveal it to us. Maybe it is sending a text. Don't be the ghosting person. I don't know. Maybe it's apologizing. Maybe it's just asking for some help or prayer. Maybe it's forgiving someone. Maybe it's starting counseling. Maybe it's simply just showing up when you said you were going to. I just want to encourage you, do not think about all the steps. Just wonder about the next one. What is your next step of growth and healing? When you look at Peter's life, he eventually became courageous enough to follow Jesus no matter what he faced, right? He followed Jesus all the way to the end. And I don't think it's because he just naturally became a braver person. I think it's because Peter became deeply convinced that he belonged to Jesus. And that meant that he no longer had to prove himself, he no longer had to protect himself, and he no longer had to run. He knew that Jesus had already crossed every barrier to come to him. And so that's my prayer for us. This week even, that the Spirit would give us the wisdom to know our next step and the courage to take that step, okay? It's that simple. Would the Spirit give us the wisdom to know our next step and the courage to take it? And that the wisdom of God could replace that temptation to put up walls and to withdraw and to grab weapons. Because I do believe the more deeply we experience belonging with Jesus, the more courage we'll have to move toward other people. Because that's where the healing begins. When we become convinced, together, I hope we can become convinced that because of Jesus, relational wounds don't get the final word in our lives. Jesus gets the final word in our lives. So as the worship team comes, I just want to pray over this because I know there's so much vulnerability and so much pain that comes from these relational wounds. So let's just take a moment to pray before we go into our time of communion and worship. Jesus, we just need you. There's been so many times in my life when I've thought I can just overcome these barriers on my own, but we can't, I can't, we need you. So I just pray, Holy Spirit, that you would just fall in this place, that you would be giving wisdom to each of us about our next step that every one of us has. And would you just fill us with the courage to be able to take those steps, one step at a time. Would you show us that you're right there with us, that you came and you sent your Spirit now so that we would never be alone in how we face the barriers that we face in our life. So I pray that empowerment over everyone here, that they would be able to hear your voice and your wisdom, to know their next step, and that they would be empowered by your Spirit to have the courage to take that step. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.